Hi there. Social Studies 20, gonna examine ultranationalism in Canada. This is actually chapter 8. I know it's been weird. We went from chapter 7, we skipped to chapter 9. Now we're coming back to chapter 8. You'll understand why when we're done chapter 8. But what we're going to take a look at is acts committed by the Canadian government that could be considered to be ultranationalist. When we think of ultranationalism, we don't often think of Canada as having ever been or being a country that would have done this. But you know what? We did. We're going to examine internment in Canada during World Wars I and World War II as examples of ultranationalism in Canada. So, to refresh your memory, World War I was a war between the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Um, the Triple Entente, of course, was Britain, France, and Russia. And when we say Britain, we mean the entire British Commonwealth along with it, too. So Britain was fighting in World War I, and when they were fighting, so was Canada, so was Australia, so was New Zealand, and so on. We were just part of the British Empire. We fought with them. The enemy for Canada, Britain, and France would have been the Central Powers. And these would, of course, include countries, or were the countries of Germany, Austria Hungary, and Italy. And so that war, as you know, raged on for 4 years. It was a very expensive war, great cost to human life economically as well. During World War I, Canada actually had to implement what is known as conscription. So drafting, forcing men to go fight the war because we were beginning to run out. And so it was a really expensive and costly war, a very emotional war for Canadians back home. And so the point I'm trying to make is that while we fought those enemies of Canada and Britain in Western Europe, a lot of people from the countries that we were fighting, a lot of people from Germany, Austria, Hungary, and so on, had already immigrated to Canada and were living in Canada as we fought that war against those countries in Western Europe. And so, as we fight the Germans in Austria Hungary, a lot of people from those countries had already been living in Canada for years and even decades. And so, what happens back home in Canada is that, those immigrants, those people from those countries that were fighting in World War I, were branded enemy aliens. An enemy alien was someone from another country living within yours, among you, and you didn't trust them. You're calling them an enemy. What makes them your enemy is that you're fighting those countries overseas. Now, it's not a rational way of looking at things, in that the people that we brand the enemy aliens had been living in Canada for years. Some of them were even second generation Canadians, meaning that they were born in Canada. So it was an unfair, prejudicial outlook and attitude toward them, and the acts of discrimination that come after are also not rational either. Don't forget that at the time, we're fighting a war, people were scared, there was a lot of confusion. Doesn't justify what happened, but maybe that explains a bit why they were branded enemy aliens. And some of the people weren't even from the countries that we were fighting, they had just been stereotyped into those groups of people, which made them targets for being enemy aliens in Canada. You need to understand a bit about the political climate. There was, a lot of racism in Western Canada at that time. There had been a series of immigration waves and patterns to Canada. And so, as you know, First Nations peoples were always in Canada. The next wave of immigration to Canada was the French, upon colonizing Quebec. And then the British would begin a second wave of immigration after they take Canada from the French. And then waves of immigration that would come after that would include peoples from Eastern Europe, peoples from Germany, Ukraine, Austria, Hungary, and so on, people from Eastern and Western Europe. So that was another wave of immigration coming to Western Canada. There wasn't a lot of tolerance for people, being different at that time. We couple that with the climate of World War I and fear, the fear that people would have lived under daily. We couple that again with just ultranationalism in general around the world at that time. And that's how we get that branding of people coming from these places as being enemy aliens and being a threat to Canada. So the fear was that these enemy aliens could rise up and overthrow the Canadian government because, after all, they are your enemy. They're descendants of the enemies that you're fighting overseas in Europe. I know it makes no sense. It's not a rational way of thinking, but that's how some people thought. There was a lot of fear mongering. And so, based on all of that fear, the climate, the enemy aliens, uh, uh, governments begin to ID and intern people um, from those areas of the world. And so, in fact, in Alberta alone by 1920, the government had interned 8,500 Ukrainian Canadians. And these were people that were not a threat to the Canadian government. But they were victims of scapegoating. They were victims of fear mongering at that time. And so a lot of these people were forcibly interned in concentration camps, not death camps, but concentration and work camps. They had to wear permanent ID. Their property was confiscated. These camps weren't closed, a lot of them, until 1920, which makes no sense because World War One ended in 1918. So even if they were a threat, and that's a reach because they weren't, but even if they were, they should have been let out in 1918 when the war was over. They were kept 2 years longer and let out in 1920. There were several of these camps in Western Canada, one actually being quite close to Banff. Um, it's an historic site now. Uh, But that is what happened to the Ukrainian Canadians during World War One in Canada, and that is an example of ultranationalism. Discrimination coupled with internment is an ultranationalistic act in Canadian history that would surprise a lot of people. A lot of people don't know about that. And again, if we go to our ultranationalism spectrum, you can see that there would have been ethnocentrism in Canada at that time for sure, because of the scapegoating of the enemy aliens, the rumor of the takeover of Canada, there were acts of discrimination, and that culminated with internment of the Ukrainian Canadians in Canada during World War One. But that's as far as it went. It didn't turn into conflict and war. It didn't lead to a genocide. Stopped with internment. Our second example is World War Two and the experience of the Japanese Canadians in this case in World War Two. Um, what's the best way to start this? Canada was never outright at war with Japan. Japan had formed the Axis powers between Japan, Germany, and Italy. And so what that meant was when America enters the war after Pearl Harbor in 1941, America's at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. So even though Canada never overtly fought against Japan in World War II, just through sheer geography and the fact that Japan was part of the Axis powers and we were fighting Germany and Italy, we kind of, were de facto fighting against Japan as well. And so the same principle will now be used for the Japanese Canadians in World War II as we found the Ukrainian Canadians in World War One. Um, Immigrants that had come from Japan to Canada years ago now were labeled enemy aliens within Canada. There was about 23,000 of them. And so even though we weren't fighting them, physically against Japan, we kind of branded them as the enemy because Japan was part of the Axis powers with Germany and Italy. So the same principle as World War One. We brand them enemy aliens. There's scapegoating. There's fear mongering. There will be acts of discrimination and again another internment. Japanese Canadians had moved to the West Coast. They'd been moving there for several decades. Um, so, there's a fair amount by World War II. And again, the same rumor circulated that, some of these Japanese Canadians could be spies, spying for Japan against Canada and possibly plotting the overthrow of Canada, or at the very least, plotting to sabotage the Canadian war effort. Again, these stories, these rumors are ludicrous. There's no truth to them. It's not rational. But Canada's fighting a war. Again, a very deadly and costly war. And that probably makes people think different. It makes them think irrationally when usually they probably think pretty rationally. I'll show you a couple of maps that'll also help you understand this too. So usually when kids look at a map of the world, they look at the west coast of Canada, and that's where the internment of the Japanese Canadians is going to happen. They look at the west coast of Canada, and then they find Japan on the map, and they go, "Oh my God, look how far away that is. It's two continents, three continents, and an entire ocean away." That's just that projection of the world. As you know, the world is round. And so if we look at from this projection, which we don't often see, we see that Japan, by proximity, is actually a lot closer to the west coast of Canada than you would think. And so just the geographical closeness of Japan to the west coast also would have done a lot to enhance the fear mongering and the scapegoating and the branding of the Japanese Canadians as enemy aliens. And don't forget too that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, which also would have added a lot of fuel to this fire too. Western seaboard in America would also imprison Japanese Canadians too. So we go back to our notes. Uh, Males were sent to a male work camp in BC. Females were sent to female internment camps in BC. Again, property was confiscated. A lot were driven out of BC altogether. Now, in this case, after World War II had come to an end, years later in 1988, there was an official redress from the government, an apology. There was some financial compensation to those that had been affected by the internment in 1942. So in this case, there was a federal redress. There was not a federal redress for the Ukrainian Canadians during World War II. So again, here is another example of ethnocentrism in Canada, leading to discrimination in Canada, leading to internment in Canada, in this case, the Japanese Canadians. So now you've got two case studies, examples of ultranationalism and internment in Canadian history that you probably didn't know of before. A lot of people don't, but um, it happened. It did happen in Canada.